Wipe chiap, wai husquaquas piayat sweet, isquis dina machen, kin suchanaken kol inkamapalux, talikin limpt apana skull halt powicum, ku kusquak alta, I siuch, ult I timhulau, ult I timu, lim kulanchuten to apana skull halt. Good morning, everybody. So nice to see you. My name is Dina Machen. I am from the Syilx Nation, the Okanagan Nation, calling in from my home community of Inkamupalux or Okanagan Indian Band. So nice to have you with us today for this discussion on water, thinking about water planning, water management, kind of from freshet to fish flows, water cycle looks like. Across the province, and we're so fortunate to have people join us today from all over the province. We're really excited for the discussion that we're going to have today. Make sure I can see all my screens here. So our agenda for today will be having an overview of the provincial water monitoring system, providing information to communities for how to access snow and hydrometric data and analysis. And we're having a case study of the Nicola Watershed. So talking about the Nicola Watershed Governance Partnership. We'll record the Zoom presentations. But when we get into the question and answer period and the discussion period, we'll stop Zoom just so that we're keeping kind of the circle closed with the discussion in case there's anything sensitive that comes up during the discussion. So before we get into the agenda and introduce our guest speakers, Julia? We're so happy to have our guest speakers join us today, Jonathan Boyd from the River Forecast Center, Brian Holmes from the Upper Nicola Indian Band, and Patrick Farmer from the Ministry of Waterland and Resource Stewardship. I also want to let you know that on the Zoom today, kind of behind the scenes, we have our IWI team. Some of our team members are on the call today. Zita Botello, co-lead with Watersheds BC. She's our IWI director. Claire Sauvage-Mar, program associate for the program. Shannon Nickerson, program manager. And Julia Benson, our communication specialist. Just to provide a little bit of background on the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative, we were established in April 2022 through a $15 million investment from the province of British Columbia that is being co-delivered through a partnership between Watersheds BC and the Make Way Foundation. The grant funds are supporting Indigenous-led or co-led projects that advance First Nations priorities for the health and security of their watersheds. The IWI is a 3-year initiative which builds on the success of the Healthy Watersheds Initiative, and IWI receives guidance from the Indigenous Leaders Advisory Circle. We're really happy to be supporting 49 Indigenous-led or co-led projects throughout the province. So you can see here the map with the distribution of the different communities and organizations that are initiating projects in their watersheds and with their communities. And really these 49 projects really address First Nation priorities for the health of their watersheds. And they kind of cross-cut many different areas and many different focus. So a lot of the projects focus on one or more of these program areas that we were able to identify through all of the project proposals, focusing on Indigenous knowledge and land-based learning, watershed monitoring and assessment, watershed planning and governance, restoration and protection, and fisheries and food sovereignty. So if you're interested in learning more about any of the projects, you can visit our website at www.indigenouswatersheds.com to learn more. So there's descriptions of all of the projects on the website, as well as some background information on the IWI and our team. So now that all of the funds have been granted and are out kind of in communities doing really good work, one of the ways that IWI is continuing to support communities is through these learning and engagements that we're doing. So one of the things that we're doing is this webinar series, and it's really just intended to hold space for Indigenous leaders, communities, and organizations and their project teams to build connections, share knowledge and learnings, and to discuss challenges and solutions relating to First Nation watershed priorities. So we're doing these webinars every couple of months, and this is the third in our series. And we really thank everybody during the registration process. We just wanted to do kind of a really quick poll to get a sense of how things were looking in different communities across the province. We asked kind of a series of yes or no questions. In the past 5 years, has your community experienced flooding within the community? Just about 60% of respondents indicated that yes, there is flooding. They have experienced flooding within the last 5 years. Have communities experienced drought that affects household use? Almost 70% of respondents indicated that their communities have had some issues with their household use for water. 40% of respondents had indicated that they did experience drought that affect food production within their communities. So thinking about community gardens or household gardens and things like that. We asked if communities had experienced any temporary or seasonal changes to their water. So thinking more about drinking water or any issues affecting community water supply. Nearly 50% of respondents indicated that they had experienced some challenges in that area within the last 5 years. And then lastly, almost 70% of respondents from across the province had indicated that their communities noticed some increase in fish mortality due to water issues, likely low water or very high river temperatures throughout the spawning and migration period. So that was just a really quick snapshot to kind of set the stage for today, to think about the various challenges that communities need to address. Thinking about the water cycle from the time that we're in now, and it's really timely that we're having this conversation. Thinking about like what the snowpack is looking like, what we might experience through the freshet period. There's already been lots in the news. The province has been very proactive this year in providing information, getting information out about last year's drought, and we're heading into this year from a drought position. And then what that could look like throughout the summer into fall, as we're waiting for salmon to enter streams and rivers across the province later in the summer and in the fall. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jonathan Boyd, from the River Forecast Center. Jonathan has served as a hydrologist with the BC River Forecast Center since 2017. He was originally hired with the group as a co-op student in 2025 and later served as a river forecast technician in 2006 and 2007. He briefly joined again for the Freshet in 2011 and in 2012 as a flood specialist. And in between, he has had some stints at BC Hydro and the BC Energy Regulatory. Jonathan, so happy to have you here today. Over to you.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me, Dina. Yeah, and thanks for the patience, Dina, as well with me and my commitment. For those obviously don't know, I was summoned to jury duty on Tuesday, so there was a little bit up in the air on whether I could partake or not, but fortunately I was not selected. And yeah, good morning. I'm calling in today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and very grateful to be able to live and work and play on these traditional lands. So it's going to be primarily an overview of the River Forecast Center operations, and then a little bit of an outlook. It's condensed. I feel like we could talk about River Forecast Center for 2 to 3 hours. So it's really just touching on some of the little blips of what we do. So moving to the next slide. You've already heard an introduction from of me from Dina there, and introducing the group that there are 10 of us. When I rejoined in 2017, so 7 years ago, it actually was just Dave there on the far left and Charles on the far right and me. There was only 3 with River Forecast Center. So we have increased now. There's 5 hydrologists, 2 technicians in IT solutions, along with Dave Campbell, who's the head of the River Forecast Center, and then above that is a manager, Andrew. And moving to the next slide. So overall, the River Forecast Center is the province's operational hydrology program, operational being like doing the day-to-day forecasting and reacting, very different than some of the research hydrologists that we do have throughout the province. And the purpose primarily is to plan, support, and respond to flood and drought. And we are really a client and stakeholder focused group. So we work very closely with emergency management and climate readiness, other provincial agencies, local governments, First Nations, the federal government, the public. It is really a group that we're always trying to serve those that need that type of drought or flood forecasting. On to the next slide. So why does the River Forecast Center exist? And the 2 biggest floods in, we'll say, the last 150 years for the province were pretty well, I'd say, province-wide, but the most damaging and noticeable effects were for the Fraser River. So 1894 is kind of the benchmark then flows ever for the Fraser River, and some examples there with the Chilliwack in 1894, and then the original Alexandra Bridge, which got destroyed from that flood, and just had a little peak there, and the river rose 27 meters to and essentially destroy that bridge. And then in 1948, again, the Fraser Valley flooded. There was a lot more settlement at that point, and then also some significant flooding for Kamloops. So that still is the potential greatest disaster that we will have from a financial and property. It is to have another large scale Fraser River flood. On to the next slide. Oh, I think was one missing. Maybe just go back. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know why one isn't showing up there. Anyways, I did have one that essentially just showed that for the past 7 years, there has been flooding somewhere across BC every year. So 2017 was Okanagan Lake, 2018 Grand Forks, 2019 Chilcotin, 2020 Chemainus, 2021 was the Coquihalla flooding, the Nicola flooding, the extreme atmospheric river event. 2022 Mission Creek had flooding. Last year, 2023 Cache Creek had flooding. So essentially every year it floods somewhere in BC, and certain communities get off maybe potentially several years without flooding, but from our perspective at River Forecast Center, somewhere along the way, whether it's rainstorms in the fall and winter, or the snow melts in the spring, or a combination of snow and rain in the spring causes flooding. And next slide. So just this will be the essential overview and outline of the presentation with the River Forecast Center operations. And starting, I guess, just go with the next slide. It's the data sources and data management side. Oh, there we go. Somehow we're bouncing around a little bit. Those are the images that I just mentioned as examples of flooding. On to the next slide. So starting with data sources and data management, next slide. There's a lot that comes into us via different channels. And even when I first worked, it was 2005. I laughed there, Dina, you misspoke and said that I started in 2025. And I would have had to have gone back to the future or something like that to have started, but it was 2005 just as a co-op student at UVic, and the operational capacity of the River Forecast Center was pretty small, and part of it was the computing power wasn't there, the satellite power, just the real-time automated stations didn't quite exist. So we have automated stations throughout, automated snow stations throughout the province, capturing what the snowpack levels are. We have not necessarily the River Forecast Center has it, but we use weather observation data, whether that's through the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Forests, or Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then hydrometric data, which is water flow and water level data that is run by the Water Survey of Canada and some other third-party groups as well. And then, of course, we have the weather forecast data right now. It's primarily just the Canadian model, but all of that comes into our servers. It gets quality controlled on a daily basis. It goes into hydrological models to then create some sort of flood or drought output. And that's really the process on a daily basis. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of computers spinning. Moving to the next slide. Just some examples of, say, the automated snow weather stations, which I'll get to at the very end, talking about the current snowpack conditions. But here's an example of one on the right is when it's snow-free. That's Oyama Lake, which was built in 2020. And the tower there houses, say, some of the weather instruments, thermometer, and the standpipe there is for precipitation. But there underneath that sheet metal and chain link fence is essentially just this bladder full of antifreeze, and it will eventually measure the weight of the snow, which there on the left is Redfish Creek, what it looks like when there is snow on top of it. And what's fantastic about these stations is that we get data essentially every hour and see how the snowpack changes throughout the season. And next slide. And then our other real big source of information is the Water Survey of Canada and the hydrometric stations. And don't have a specific picture of one. It's not as dramatic of a station because a lot is happening underwater. But the Water Survey of Canada has these all throughout the province, and essentially it's measuring the water level on a real-time basis, and there will be technicians that go out usually about 3 to 4 times a year, and they'll actually record discharge values. So they'll go into the river, or they'll slide across on a cableway and create a relationship between the water level and the discharge, just known as a rating curve. And from the River Forecast Center perspective, we always are using the discharge that's created through that calculation. And the reason being is just that water level is unique to every single specific location, whereas discharge eventually, it's just the flow of the river, the total flow, and we can use that in our models to calculate further downstream. And next slide. So moving into the modeling side, next, there's a number of models run by the River Forecast Center, even a few more with seasonal volume forecasts, but just highlighting the Clever model, that's the one that I'll talk about the most here. It's our main model with about 400 locations, providing a forecast for about 10 days. Initially, it was really designed just to be a spring freshet model, I think maybe with about 60 or 70 sites, and it has now become our standard operational model throughout the province. Then there's the coffee model, which is more of a statistical based approach focused purely on coastal regions for the fall and winter and rainstorm events. We have a Raven model, which provides more of a 10-day deterministic seasonal ensemble, specifically for forecasting reservoir inflows into Okanagan Lake. And then the Warren's model is our legacy model that goes back to the 1970s, and really that's all that existed up until about maybe 10 years ago at the River Forecast Center. There was just the one model that was for 16 points on the Fraser River. And then there's one called the ELF that it's a little bit more complicated. It's essentially creating a worst case scenario in, say, the summertime of what are the flows going to be like in 30 days if the continued dominant weather pattern continues. So it doesn't necessarily factor in weather forecasts. It just has more of a statistical, how much is it going to continue to recede. And I know that a lot of regional staff will use that one. Okay, next slide. So just how the CLEVER model works. The CLEVER stands for the Channel Links Evolution Efficient Routing Model. And say on the left there, we've got 4 numbers that they represent gauge stations, kind of those hydrometric stations that Water Survey of Canada might have. And from there, moving to the next slide, or pardon me, moving back, just the next image, the middle one there, it then puts sub-basins for each of those numbers. And then from there, it essentially tries to calculate what happens downstream. So like 1 eventually goes into 3, 2 and 3 go into 4, and then there's also kind of that localized input as well. So next slide. And what that actually kind of means just within a sub-basin is what's going on is trying to calculate the rainfall, the snow melt, the current river flow, evapotranspiration, which is a combination of evaporation and transpiration, just losing water to the atmosphere. Then there's also infiltration into the groundwater, just the groundwater release. So there's a lot of math. I was going to show the formulas as well, but I was worried about people's heads exploding. So we'll just simplify it with just that graph there. And then next slide. The output is a lot more user-friendly, and this is just from, I think it was, I guess, last week, but there really wasn't much going on because it's so dry. Just chose the Bonaparte River there as one that had a lot of challenges last year, but within our website, we do have a link to the CLEVER model map, and you can search for your area and find out if there are gauged rivers that do have CLEVER forecasts. And then from there, say in the springtime, it's for sure a daily updated model, but at this time of year, we might do it maybe twice a week at the start of the week and either Thursday or Friday. Next slide. And really the biggest challenge with the model is interpreting the model results. And the model has limitations. There's lots of uncertainties. Sometimes we'll see in the media that the River Forecast Center is predicting this, and the answer is no, the CLEVER model output shows this result, and it's based on this one input of weather forecast parameters from the Canadian model, and there are other models as well. So there's always a lot of uncertainty. It can be just the actual number of stations that we have in an area. Some of the model watersheds don't have climate information within or even nearby. There's errors in the sensor instruments. Again, different weather models. The storms that are arriving can be dynamic. An atmospheric river is actually a really narrow band of intense moisture, and it can shift by several hundred kilometers from what was predicted, and an area that was supposed to be dry ends up becoming hit and very wet, and the area that was predicted to be wet ends up being dry. So there's a lot of challenges with the model results, and we interpret it and encourage it as like a tool to understand what might happen, but it's not the guarantee. And next slide. So moving over to the data analysis side of our work, this graph here is the percentile of daily stream flow conditions across the entire province. So anytime we're into that red situation, kind of orangey red, it's stations that are below the 5th percentile. So 5th percentile being like getting to that level once every 20 years at that particular date. And then if it's bluer, that's when we have the flows are doing relatively well. And this is just last year showing essentially from, well, it's actually 2022 to 2024. So it's over the last 2 years or so that in the fall of 2022, we got hit with a drought that showed up There was a little bit of a blip there in May of last year, some blue, but that was just actually really hot weather resulting in a rapid melt of the snow, so an early melt. And then we ended up with probably the worst provincial-wide drought that we've seen in at least the last 45 years or so. And next slide, what's neat about a plot like that is we can recreate the entire, well, a longer term record. So going back to 1980, so just listed out by decades with 1980s, 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and then the 2020s there. And from a provincial standpoint, the past, say, year and a half has been the worst and steadiest low flow conditions for the province. And unfortunately, based on the snowpack and what I'll show later, the worst may still yet be to come. So a little bit of a downer there. Yeah, thanks. And the next slide here has the groundwater conditions. Similar idea. It's just instead of having 400 sites, there's anywhere from maybe about 97 to 150. So there's not quite as many locations, and more specifically, there isn't the geographic spread that we have for the hydrometric stations. So the bulk of these are on Vancouver Island or the Fraser Valley, Pemberton Valley, in the Okanagan, Thompson region, up around kind of that Dawson Creek area, or the Bulkley as well. So unfortunately, we don't have a huge spread, but still the same story that it's very dry. The groundwater is a little bit slower to show the drought conditions compared to the rivers, but it's also slower to respond or recover. And next slide. And onto the snowpack conditions. So this is just kind of an example of how you can look at it on a daily basis here. And the link is actually through the Ministry of Environment. They have a snow, they're the official snow program where there are technicians who go out and maintain the automated stations throughout the year. Just an example here with the Squamish River, which dates back to 1989, and it is tracking at its all-time record low since 1989. And next slide. And into the advisories and warnings, really one of the most important aspects of our job. Next slide is setting the high stream flow advisory. This is when rivers are rising quite rapidly or expected to rise very soon. Possibility of some minor flooding in low-lying areas, and usually from a return period, it's about a 2 to 5 year return period. And what that means is that, say, a 1 and 2 year flow is a peak flow that you might get once every 2 years. So statistically, it's about 50%. Oftentimes, they aren't treated very seriously. Unfortunately, my history is that most of the deaths that we've had, unfortunately, have been from high stream flow advisory conditions. And it's just when people aren't prepared. Usually when it is flooding, people stay well clear of rivers, but when it's just moving really fast, that's when people get close to the banks and unfortunately can get washed away. A flood watch is typically issued when it's kind of in that 5 to 10 year return period flow. So pretty significant, but not necessarily like catastrophic, and seeing that areas adjacent to the river flooding. And then the flood warning is when there's significant flooding. And in some ways, that event in November 2021 might have even needed another category, which was a severe flood warning, where it gets to a level that hasn't been seen, and saw that, of course, with the Coldwater and Nicola and Coquihalla. And next slide. So just to touch on these. Oh, someone might have. Is anyone else hearing the? There we go. I think everyone got muted. I hope you can hear me again. So with the flood warnings and advisories, the challenge is that they're really broad brushed, and we have a map layer on our website that kind of highlights the area, but you have to actually dig in and read the advisories to know the exact locations. It's just really, really challenging to map the exact spots of where flooding will or won't occur. Oftentimes, say the flood warnings aren't issued until we're actually into the flooding situation. And as I mentioned, high stream flood advisories are serious. We usually will aim for about 2 to 3 days lead time, but sometimes it's only about 24 to 48 hours beforehand. And we can move quite rapidly from high stream flow advisory up to flood watch to flood warning within 1 day. And just the last little note there, that catastrophic flooding is not predictable over the long range. It's always a possible scenario, and it really just falls down into what the weather is going to do. And sometimes we'll hear like, oh, AI will know what to do. And it's been neat because there are now tools. Google has an AI flood predictor, and to see it in action just a few weeks ago with some atmospheric rivers on the south coast, sometimes it was good, and sometimes it wasn't very good. So it really is always a challenge, and to be prepared for your region, at least for the upcoming year, not necessarily seeing much flood potential in those areas that deal with spring snowmelt related flooding. This is probably the lowest risk year that I've seen for sure. Next slide. So then just getting into the operations side of things, next one. So our products and services kind of already talked about the flood warnings and advisories, same with the real-time analysis and forecasting. So then touching on the snow bulletin, the 7-day outlook, and not specifically a special slide for it, but a lot of our work is on briefings to, we still say EMBC there, but it's EMCR now, and local provincial or local governments, other provincial agencies, media, senior executive. There's a lot of communication, essentially trying to take that complicated modeling output and put it in a way that the average user can understand. And just next slide, I think it just grays out those two. So already talked about those two. And next slide. So for the snow bulletin, that's published at the start of the month in January to April, and then twice monthly, May to June. The May to June ones typically are just to highlight whether the snow has melted earlier than normal, it's delayed, or if it's kind of a seasonal melt. In terms of importance, the April 1st is number one, and probably the next one is the March 1st, which is scheduled for March 8th, and it gives that final heads up. By March 1st, usually about 80% of the seasonal snowpack has accumulated, so it gives a really good idea of what's to come. I think I see Claire providing the links there on where the snow bulletins exist. So it's really thorough document. There's the data is there for people who want the data. The map is there for people that want maps, and then there is a write-up for people who want to read it. It's usually about 24 pages and quite thorough. And then the next slide is just highlighting our website, and it actually just changed like 2 weeks ago. The full government template for websites changed. So we used to have kind of 3 columns, an extra column on the right for our map links in BC, or sort of other BC links. So that's now further down on the website, and you just have to scroll. It was one of those attempts to make it more mobile user friendly, but it made it maybe a little bit trickier for those that use it on the desktop. But all of our information is just pumped into the River Forecast Center website, and yeah, there is a lot there, and it's not too complicated. There's really only a few pages to go to, like the advisories, the current stream flow conditions, modeling, and then the snow bulletin and snow conditions. And next slide. And yeah, I'll just say, if you want to opt in here, it's at the bottom there, rfc@gov.bc.ca. I'd like to say that first so you have time to write it down or type it out. So we have, in the last maybe year and a half, started to provide a 7-day outlook, and it's not necessarily meant to go to public, but it is to kind of emergency managers, other provincial employees, just anyone who's interested in getting a little bit of a heads up on the 7-day flood conditions. So we issue it twice a week, usually Monday afternoon and Thursday morning, depending, of course, on holidays. And then during the drought and low flow season, it's typically just one time per week, but provides an update on what we can expect in the short term, the next 1 to 3 days, and then a little bit longer term, 4 to 7 days. And the reason being is there's a lot of times where there's an atmospheric river that looks to be coming on day 6 or 7, and then it never actually arrives. And we can't issue a flood warning for events when they really have a low probability of occurring. But this gives us that opportunity to share that there could be some challenges in 6 or 7 days, but we'll have to wait and see, and provides that early notice. And usually there's a picture of the day as well. And to the next slide, I think just down to the last 4 or 5 here, and looking towards what to expect this year, and kind of foreshadowed it a little bit with it's not looking great. And February 1st, the snow bulletin had a BC average of 61% of normal. For January 1st, the average was 56% of normal, so it did bump up a little bit from a BC average. If I were to predict what it would be today, like there's been almost no snow at all for February, so it might be down around 55 at this point. And compared to last year, the March 1st bulletin, the average was 91% of normal. So last year, it was kind of an average snow year, maybe just a little bit below normal, and significantly lower this year. And on to the next slide. This one is showing how very little snow has accumulated since February. It's a composite of, say, that Upper Squamish plot that I showed was just one station. Now this is about 47 stations combined together, just to give kind of a provincial context, and only goes back to about 1988. Just that's when a lot of the automated stations started to get built there, but really tracking near the lowest, or now actually at the lowest since 1988 based on these stations. And the purple line there is last year. And last year, by the time we got to May 1st, it was essentially at the median. So it was kind of an average snow year. And then we had just a rapid melt in May. So if we were to have those May conditions occur again and the same climate conditions again, this year would be far worse than last year. The possibility is, what if the snowmelt occurs even earlier, which is like late March or April, and then we have another situation where it's dry all spring and summer. It could be far worse. It's just we don't know because we can't truly predict the weather past about 2 weeks. Okay, next slide. And moving up just to the Fort Nelson region to show why we are in a drought, and it really revolves around the last 2 years and being in a precipitation deficit. And more specifically, it's almost like a year and a half. It was July 2022 where it just noticeably got dry, and has been relatively dry since. So even though there have been some areas on the coast that have gotten hit hard with rain in, say, December and January, it hasn't necessarily recovered the situation. And Fort Nelson here is about as drastic as can be, where I've plotted 2022 to 2023, essentially from, like, I think it started there February 12th or so. So it's not the calendar year, it's kind of mostly 2022 with a little bit of 23, and then the current year, sort of the last 365 days there, is the 2023-2024, which is at 49% of the total precipitation. So just ridiculously low for the past 1 year, like record breaking going back to 1938, and then going to 2 years, just showing how it's that long-term deficit, and it'll take a long time to get out of that deficit. And next slide. And I think this is the last one before the summary slide. So we are in an El Nino year. El Ninos tend to be most noticeable in the situation of like winter and spring temperatures. It's not necessarily a guarantee that the snowpack is low. Certainly at like the lower elevations we see that, or potentially, say, Vancouver Island will have a little bit lower snow during an El Nino year. It's not a guarantee that the whole province is. I've seen people say that the whole snowpack is low across the province because of El Nino. That's not quite the case. It really is just the dominant weather patterns weren't setting up for snow, and the El Nino signal is still to come, which means that oftentimes we get earlier melts than normal with El Ninos compared to La Ninas, where we can have kind of delayed melts. And I think 2022 was an example of a La Nina where we didn't even get the melt happening until late May. It was really, really cold in April and May of that year. So I'm worried that it's El Nino and that we're going to get really hot conditions, say in late March or April, and melt the snowpack that is already very, very low and more susceptible to melting quicker because of how low it is. And then just the last summary slide here, which is, could the upcoming summer have a worse drought than last year in 2023? And yeah, the answer is of course maybe. There's no way to definitively say so. 2019 was really our last low snow year. It was our last El Nino year. We had at that point the warmest May on record until last year. Really early melts. The province and regions were ramping up for a really intense drought in 2019, and then the rains arrived in late June and just lasted through the summer. That's when the Chilcotin flooded in July. The North Thompson had like multiple high stream flow advisories in late July. The South Coast had high stream flow advisories in early August. So we can just have a really quote unquote crummy summer for weather wise, but it ends up being fantastic from a water resource perspective. But the challenges that are upcoming this year compared to last year is we have these long-term precipitation deficits. The rivers are still running fairly low with their base flows. The snowpack levels are incredibly low, and El Nino could lead to an earlier melt than normal. And really the temperatures in the spring are key, and then precipitation in the spring and summer are going to be the key. And then I think I have the last slide just as questions, but we'll probably save those till the end and make sure that we get through the other presentation as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. A small but mighty team you have at the River Forecast Center. It's just amazing that the amount of information and data that you're dealing with and trying to get that out to the public in a timely manner is no small feat. We've been putting in the chat some links to the River Forecast Center. We know this was a lot of information, and as Jonathan said, we could have talked about this probably for about 2 or 3 hours. So we really do encourage people to have a look at the center's website and to have a look at some of the maps and resources that are available there, and encourage you to reach out to the Forecast Center if you have any questions. So thank you again, Jonathan. Next, we have our co-presenters. Brian Holmes is a member of the Syilx Nation. He is a for the Upper Nicola Indian Band, Chief and Council, first elected in 2011, and he has served 4 consecutive terms. He's received certificates for restorative justice facilitator training, a diploma in police sciences, and land guardian certificates. And he is actively leading various projects in his community, like the invasive species eradication, water quality monitoring, stream flow monitoring, and many other freshwater initiatives. Joining Brian today is Patrick Farmer, a senior authorization specialist with the Ministry of Water, Lands, and Resource Stewardship in Merritt. He has worked for water stewardship for 12 years, managing people who use water and while trying to conserve water use for the benefit of everything that needs it. He is a professional forester and agrologist with a passion for protecting water and working with water users to better understand its importance. So turning it over to Brian and Patrick to talk about the Nicola Watershed Governance Partnership.
Thanks, Dina. Good morning, everybody. Coming talking to you here from Stolo territory. I was on my way to Harrison to speak at the Fisheries Council Assembly. So I just wanted to talk today about this partnership, and interesting from Jonathan, I think we developed a partnership to not 100% rely on AI. Interesting comment there. But the Nicola Watershed Partnership has been a development over the last 5 years, and it has really kind of played a role in terms of our conversation and our response to flooding, drought, probably more specifically in the past 4 years as we evolve and develop our relationship and our response to these initiatives that seem to be changing ever so quickly as we go day by day. Next slide. So this partnership, it takes place in two nations, the Inclacauquet Nation and the Silk Nation. And so the Nicola 5 chiefs came together in 2018 to really solidify this MOU with the province. And it's really just to bring our Indigenous knowledge, language from both of these communities or both of these nations into the work that we're doing and managing water specifically in the watershed. So next, and Patrick, you can start to these ones.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll introduce myself first. So Patrick Farmer, I'm speaking to you from the Empnokhapmuk and Silk Nation today in beautiful Nicola Valley in Merritt. So as Brian mentioned, we're trying to bring traditional knowledge as well as language into the work. Another thing we've spent a lot of time and was one of the first projects that got kicked off in this partnership was to rejuvenate, rediscover Empnokhapmuk and Silk protocols or laws. And what you're seeing on this slide is the Grandmother's Teachings, which is a protocol from the Empnokhapmuk Nation, and then from the Silk Nation. And so these two protocols or laws are foundational in the work that we do. They guide all the projects, they guide our documents, they guide the way we think and the way we carry out the work. Next slide. So to build on that, what you're looking at here is a graphic. We had a graphic artist join us for an all-day session that we had up at Douglas Lake, up in the Upper Nicola territory. And we were out on the land and inside a pit house talking about protocols of our drought group, the local drought group, the Nehehip Management Committee, which looks after drought in the Nicola Valley. And this protocol was meant to replace like a colonial version where we're talking about like a terms of reference. This is really, this document and these laws or protocols really guide how we carry out the work, how we speak to one another, how we build relationships together, how we learn together, with a common objective of ensuring that like we all share the same responsibility to ensure that water can make all of its connections. And what you're seeing on this is a blending of those two different nations of laws kind of coming together to guide the work, guide the people, and guide the project. Next slide.
So these next series of slides will highlight the kind of importance of why that partnership and that drought kind of committee that is called the Nehehip Committee plays an important role. And we look here, we'll use 21 as an example. Nicola was a very rough year for water in terms of drought throughout that year. So this was, starting in July, and I think the heat dome actually started in about June that year. And I think this is maybe about 1,000 liters per second on this one. So this is the Nicola River, the outlet of Douglas Lake, which is Upper Nicola's community. You can see there on the either side of the banks. So it's really an important indicator for us in the headwaters to kind of see where things are transitioning as time goes on. If we go to the next slide, this is 30 days later. That's just how drastically it's changed. I would say this one here, you're maybe about 300, 400 liters a second. And it just becomes quite quickly, things change and the reaction time needs to be quite quick. And so through this partnership with the province, we're able to kind of have the on the spot discussions or weekly discussions and kind of put those recommendations to what drought levels would be. And then in turn that kind of puts out the direction from there. As in this upper piece, there's only really two big license holders, there's Upper Nicola and Douglas Lake Ranch. But as you get down into the bottom part of the Nicola River, past Merritt, and up the Coldwater River, there's many more users. That's what makes it a little bit more challenging, but we're making progress in terms of building relationships and conversations with water users, stakeholders, just in terms of managing water use differently. If you go to the next slide. And this is just goes into September, and this continued basically right into November, which is pretty brutal because we go into September. This is when, at least in the lake side, the kokanee are trying to spawn out of the lakes, but I don't know if there's very good spawning grounds when we've got flows like this, and it just transitions into the Chinook and Coho when they're trying to come up as well, as the lack of flows just continue downstream. Next slide.
Yeah, so as Brian mentioned, drought is one of the events that brought us together. And this is the Nicola River, actually above of all the photos that you've seen that Brian showed you there. This is above. This is above any real water use as well. Like, this is what Mother Nature is sending us in August. And unfortunately, this photo is becoming more and more regular. And you can see how wide that channel is and how much water would be there in Freshet, but there's so little in the summer. And this is really we're getting closer to the headwaters of the main water supply for the Nicola Valley. And it just, highlights the need for us to all work together, and come together to formulate solutions, be more proactive, communicate with each other, so that everybody can be prepared before we get to this point. Like, you have to have a plan in place, and that's what I would say a lot of the focus is in our group. We unfortunately have to react to this, which takes up a lot of our time, which Brian mentioned, but we're also trying to be more proactive in our communication, meet with folks through the winter, have, kinds of plans of attack. Jonathan brought up with the forecasting for 2024. This is kind of what we're sort of expecting going forward. The dry periods are just longer. We live in a semi-desert area. It's always been low. There's stories of people with streams drying up, and there's stories of people walking across the backs of the salmon, which kind of highlights the two bookends of our watershed and what can be there. Unfortunately, the stories of people walking across the backs of the salmon are no longer stories of today, but the stories of people being able to walk across streams without getting their feet wet are starting to turn into the stories of today and tomorrow. So yeah, we all have to work together and kind of lean in on what we're going to do about this, because it's not up to any one person, and it's too big a challenge to deal with at any one level of government. Next slide.
Just back on that one, go back to that one. And so this, when we look at this water level, this prompts kind of legislation to go into an order to shut people off. You look at the time frame of this, right? When you're in agriculture, you're still trying to pump out water and grow crops. Interestingly enough, the work we do in the relationships with Douglas Lake Ranch on this one was quite unique, because I think this photo was near the end of August, when we came to an agreement with Douglas Lake Ranch to shut off all irrigation at a certain date, I think at the end of August, and we achieved that. And I had to put this photo in here because it just highlights that even with all that shut off and the relationship work, we still didn't have enough water in the main stem coming from the headwaters. So it really, to me, it really showed the legislation we're using in terms of drought is reactive, and we really need to emphasize on how do we address this, right, when there's not even any uptake from the water from this point up. You know, in my lifetime, this is my first experience with this, but I've talked to elders, and they've said, you know, they've experienced this before. And maybe their water withdrawal use was a little bit less back in that time that they recall, but nonetheless, it's becoming a different type of cycle, different timing, different issues that you know, we've made bigger impacts that are longer lasting. So how do we kind of change and think about how do we fix this, right? And that's kind of the conversation in this partnership work that we're doing. You know, we're maybe looking at storage or other measures that, you know, could help this out, because you know, coming here in August, we still got 3-4 months before any real snow or precipitation, and so it just makes that the other issues come along with water quality and all that stuff. So next slide. So then we throw in these fires that are becoming more and more frequent. I think in this Nicola watershed, we've had 4 major fires impacting the watershed at all different areas of the river system, from the headwaters down to the lower part of the Nicola. I think we've got the July Mountain, the Lytton, the Rossmore fire last year, and the White Rock Lake fire have all become a concern because of what's burnt and how it's burning, and how that impacts the water. Interestingly enough, during this White Rock Lake fire, and unfortunately on the Nicola watershed side of this fire, because it was kind of in the Salmon River watershed, but there was a portion of it that was in the Nicola watershed. Some of the fire guard building, they ended up just running machines through the creeks in Beeks Creek when they were advised not to, because of the serious drought level 5 we were in, and where they were building guard did not warrant to disturb the water or put machines through the water, but they did. And I've heard other incidences where, you know, fire guards up north are being built through crazy spots and disturbing water. So we really just need to think about, you know, how do we look after this on a long term, because you know, we're the ones locally that are sitting here trying to deal with the aftermath of these, not only the fire causes piece, but also the human caused issues. So it's really important to be quite involved in all aspects of the wildfires, from response to cleanup as well. You know, doing a lot of the rehab work with local First Nations, and making sure water is a priority when we do this work. Next slide. And so this is This is the one portion that I was talking about is in the Nicola watershed. This is up by Sucker Lake, White Man Creek. It's just down below, and it's kind of at that split where it'll go down to the Okanagan and the other side will come to the Nicola. As you can see, the other side of the valley didn't burn. So we got fairly lucky in this fire that only a portion was impacted by the fire. But as you come further south, like the July Mountain, had bigger impacts and devastation to it. And it really, I think, emphasized the results of the atmospheric river that was experienced this following, I think a month after this picture was taken. And it just made things way worse because you could see the extreme of how hot things burnt, and it just cooked everything. And there's examples of this across all fires where it's up and down. Next slide. And so this goes into the, like I mentioned, the water quality concerns. This is Douglas Lake. This is the worst algae blooms that I've experienced in Douglas Lake and surrounding lakes were similar. And this was actually in 2022, which, given what we experienced for freshet, I wouldn't have expected this because we ended up having a pretty cool and wet spring that year. And we can tell by the fires, when we flew over the fires, everything was green and great, and we didn't expect to have any water quality issues, but the cumulative impacts that come and sit in these lakes start to show up, you know, a year later or months later. And I would say that year we experienced way worse cyanobacteria blooms than we did in the heat dome in 2021. I would have expected that we would have got worse in 2021 because the water surface temperatures were 30 degrees Celsius at the surface. But we didn't have as much algae blooms as we did in 2022. And I would say since 2017, at least in Douglas Lake, 2017, we experienced part of that flooding. We majorly flooded in the upper piece where our community was evacuated in Kosciana because we had overland flooding. And then Nicola Lake started to fill up, and it backed up and started filling the groundwater back in and then through the culverts. So it was just a bunch of craziness that year. And since then, you know, a lot of the land had washed away. There were some hay fields, part of a feedlot that had washed away. So it just created a whole bunch of nutrients in the lake. And so we're expecting to experience this continually each year, which causes concern because it causes issue, you know, for recreational use, cattle use. Ceremonial use. You know, I don't.
Oh, we're starting to have you cut out a little bit, Brian.
Change and kind of get back to stop impacting and destroying the thing. So that's I think I have anything.
Yeah, you were starting to cut out.
Did you lose me?
Yeah, we cut out there just a little bit.
Okay, Patrick, did you have anything to close?
Yeah, I think what Brian was bringing up before he kind of cut out there is that water quality affects everything. It affects ecological values, it affects cultural values, it affects agriculture, food security, like everything. And it's not going to be as simple as just storing water in the one lake. We have to heal the entire watershed from these catastrophic fires and these extreme dry periods that we're getting in the summers now, and the heat. So I think it just highlights the need for all of us to work together and come up with, you know, multiple solutions to help watersheds heal and yeah, move forward for all beings that live in the watershed.
Great. Thank you, Brian and Patrick, for sharing. And it really just shows the power of relationships when coming together in a crisis situation like this, that the power of relationships and having good relationships means that you can have hard conversations with each other and with other water users in the valley to try to come up with kind of a shared or common solutions to address the short-term challenges that you're facing. Thanks again for sharing the work that you're doing in the Nicola watershed. Before we close the webinar down, I do have a little bit of a bonus speaker that wasn't on the list, but I'd like to introduce to you Deborah Curran, a professor and the executive director of the Environmental Law Center with the University of Victoria. Deb's area of expertise is really focused on water law, and she's done a lot of work in relation to Indigenous water laws, and at the time when the province was developing the new Water Sustainability Act, Deb had done quite a bit of work as well with providing information and support to communities through that engagement process. So hopefully, Deborah, you're still on the line, and you might be able to talk just really briefly about some tools in the WSA, specifically the environmental flows and fish protection orders or temporary protection orders.
Yeah, thanks so much. Dina, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. So I so appreciate getting an update both on the very scary snowpack and what we might be facing this summer, but also from all of the folks in the Nicola who are doing something new in the province and doing really important work that we are all following and also hoping to stand on in the future. I'm actually coming to you here from Squamish territory. I'm heading over to Bowen Island to talk about water and do some visiting. And I'm specifically wanted just to very quickly encourage folks to do something within their communities, irrespective of if you have a water table with the province or have any other large initiatives. Just take some small steps that are part of your own authority over water. And so specifically under the Water Sustainability Act, although that's a state tool, what the province can recognize are emergency orders and fish protection orders. So if you decide within your own legal order or your own protocols at what point users of water, so those who are extracting water, have to stop doing that given low flow conditions and low groundwater conditions, then you are able to make those declarations within your own legal orders like the Penticton Indian Band did last summer. And that then sends the message to the province that they then need to also, within the state legal order, make an emergency order or a fish protection order to preserve those values. So although very difficult for agriculture, as has been mentioned, and the fact that folks need to shut off their taps, it sends a message that a much larger watershed scale discussion needs to occur and more robust planning has to happen in all of the watersheds and in all territories across BC. Thanks very much, Dina.
Great, thanks, Deb. I know that was really quick for folks. I think we put something in the chat as well, where a link to the Water Sustainability Act and some information on those orders specifically, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about them. Again, I would really like to say thank you to all of the speakers. It was a lot of information, but really great information, very informative. Hopefully that will give communities and folks on the call today kind of a good starting point to think about how their community may address some of the water challenges that they could face this year. So before we get into the Q&A, again, I just would like to thank everybody that was able to join us today on the webinar. And we'll be providing some further information on future webinars through our email listserv.